In this video, we are going to be hooking up all of this JavaScript to Redux and to React Native. Let's get started. If you remember, we set up our index.ios.js file with a bunch of imports. We brought in the provider, we brought in Redux, we brought in the Redux thunk, and create logger. So now let's try and get all of this wiring hooked up to some of the files that we put together in the last video. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to describe the logger middleware. Now this is relatively straightforward. You just have to look at the documentation. In our case, it's a one-liner, so I'm just going to create a logger, and I'm going to set it up so that it only functions in development. What this is doing is this is basically checking to see if I'm in development mode. This __dev__ is a global constant for Node in general. And so it's passed to the React Native runtime. And that way the logger only functions in development mode. So you don't need to worry about spamming people once you go into prod. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually configure my store. I'm going to create my own function here called configure store. And it will take an initial state. This can come from all sorts of places depending on your particular implementation. Again, this is more boilerplate, and maybe it's worth kind of mentioning that there's a philosophical reason why there's a bit of boilerplate that we're writing, which is that oftentimes in the JavaScript ecosystem, you're dealing with a lot of little libraries and you're bringing them together to form a framework that makes sense for your application. So it's helpful to know what all these little libraries do. Many of them are very, very simple, but at the end of the day, it's your job as the developer working in this ecosystem to mix and match them and put them in a composable fashion that makes sense for the application you're trying to build. So we are going to create a store, and this is kind of like your Flux store, and we're going to do that using Redux's pattern for configuring a store, which involves these reducers. So in our case, I'm going to describe an enhancer, and an enhancer is essentially a way of composing a bunch of different middleware, a bunch of different functions that run through each transformation of state of your application. And so in this case, I'm going to compose, and compose takes 2 arguments, but we're only interested in 1 for now. We're going to say apply middleware, and we're going to put 2 pieces of middleware in place. One is the thunk middleware, which we're going to talk about in a future video, and the other is the logger middleware, which we just described. Now we've done that, so we've basically got our apply middleware function, compose middleware, logger middleware. So this is where you would put any other kind of middleware that you might want. The Redux ecosystem has plenty of examples of this, and here we're just using 2 of them. And then I'm just going to return the create store method with reducer, initial state, which gets passed in as an argument, and enhancer, which is the configuration of our store. Now the only thing we haven't described here is the actual reducer. The reducer was actually something we put together in a previous video. So we can just import the reducer from app reducers. So that, my friend, is the store. The next thing we want to do is we actually want to create the store. So I'm going to run this function. So I'm going to say const store equals configure store. And then the initial state that I'm going to provide is going to be nothing. Now, in some applications, you would actually put in an initial state. If you were building, for example, an isomorphic web app, you might provide an initial state to render React components. In our case, this is a mobile app, and so we're not going to provide any initial state, for now anyways, and keep things nice and simple. You could, of course, also prefetch or provide some preliminary information for booting up your application, and this is where you would probably do it. So we've got our store in place. We've got these imports, which we're probably going to get rid of. We've got the style sheet, and in fact, I don't think we're going to need any of these styles, so for now I'm just going to delete them. And that means that none of this will work. Just delete that for now. We don't need our hello world anymore. Okay, so we have our store, we have our reducer. The next step is to provide essentially an application description. Now, instead of loading a component called peckish, which is what is done by default with React Native, I'm going to create a new class, and I'm just going to call it app. And this is a convention that I've seen a few different projects online use, and it seems to make sense to me. And app is going to be a function that uses a provider component, takes in the store, which we just described, and inside of that we're going to have a container. So for now, let's just put peckish in here. And then instead of registering peckish, we'll register app. So now we are wrapping peckish inside of this provider. And this serves as the root node for our application and connects us to Redux, because provider, as you can see up here, is provided by the React Redux library. So let's go back and refresh this and see if everything is working. Ah, lucky us, we got our first error. So let me just zoom out a little bit. Create is not defined in configure store. Create, oh yes, because I was being sloppy, I wanted to say create store, not just create. Refresh that again. Store does not have a valid reducer. Make sure the argument passed to combine reducers is an object whose values are reducers. So it's looking at import reducer from reducers. Let's take a look here. I think we actually need to describe our reducer here. So let's do that. So under app reducers recipes, we're going to actually implement a very rudimentary reducer. As I mentioned in the presentation a few videos ago, our reducers can be very simple. I'm going to import that create reducer function from the lib folder. And I'm also going to import all of the types from actions types. Now, I'm going to use that function that I mentioned was a bit abstract. For searched recipes, I'm going to create a searched recipes reducer, and I'm going to use the create reducer method and just keep it nice and empty and easy for now. Refresh this again, and so far so good. It looks like nothing is broken, the app is running, and we probably have a rudimentary application in place. If I go back to index.ios, there's peckish, there's some text views, I am peckish. Refresh this again, and we should see I am peckish at the top. All the styling has been removed. Very good. So in the next video, I'm going to walk through the actual Redux example and show you how all of this wiring actually functions. Thanks for listening.